Reverend Carpenter, I would underscore by reciprocating my feeling for you and my respect and veneration. This is a growing and ever more growing deeper relationship and friendship, which I am truly enriched on a host of levels. I thank you. With regard to being an associate pastor associate, still getting comfortable with the terminology, rabbi, reverend, rabbi. I do have a few demands, and I'd like to state those in a very forthright manner. Number one, an assigned parking space. Number two, a corner office. And while I'm at it, what the heck? 6-month sabbatical every year. I can't also underscore and repeat enough what a gift it is for me to stand in front of you in your house of worship as a co-religionist who, like you, struggles and not just struggles, but embraces the notion of the transcendent of God. I don't believe for a nanosecond we are an oops of the universe. That there's something deeper, and there is a purpose to our existence that emanates far beyond just amino acids that come together over an infinite number of space and time, and poof, out we come. There is a God who loves us, who expects certain behaviors from us, but that is a bond that we share independent of everything else, and that by itself is a gift. Calvin Coolidge was the 30th president of the United States, and he dies in 1933. And he's described by a good number of historians as being very taciturn, to the point, with a wry sense of humor. And an account one Sunday morning is written of him. He comes back from church, and his wife engages him in discussion, asking him, what did the Reverend talk about? To which he said he spoke about sin. To which his wife further pumped him by asking, what did the Reverend say? To which the president responded, he's against it. So what does the Rabbi, Reverend Rabbi, whatever I am, have to present to you today? The importance of perspective. And if I am able to generate discussion, ideally favorable discussion that transcends the walls of this holy church, and someone asks you, so what did the rabbi say about the importance of perspective? You can tell them succinctly, he's in favor of it. So much of life is based on our perspective. The way we react, the way we form our worldview, the way we spend our resources, the way we prioritize our lives, the way we look at our fellow human beings. It all comes ultimately from one's perspective. Forming a perspective in life goes beyond one's environment or genetics or economics or level of education. It depends most heavily, most centrally, on how we choose to react. And that is a gift from God. Freedom of choice, how we choose to react. I want to anchor my brief, I hope, and intend remarks this morning around a biblical passage that comes from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 through 3. And the text reads as follows. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate of our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. I read this section and sections of similar to it, and I'm reminded of the great 20th century biblical scholar Gunther Plaut, who asked his congregation, who's the most tragic figure in the Bible? And people might say Job, Christian narrative, Jesus, or some of the disciples, maybe Miriam. And Gunther Plaut, stroking his chin, listening to the response, says, no, God. God is the most tragic figure in the Bible. You imagine? Could you imagine? You are plucked from the hellhole of slavery. You are en route to an elevated way of living, a substantive improvement of life for you, your neighborhood, your family. And this is what you're complaining about? This is the generation that witnessed the splitting of the Red Sea, the miracles of the plagues that dislodged their fellow Israelites, a transformation into freedom. And they romanticize about life in Egypt. Talk about a perverse sense of perspective. Perspective is key. As cliche as it may sound, a healthy perspective will help you deal with setbacks and success, tragedy, and triumph. And I say that with respect because I'm telling you essentially what you live and know yourselves. And ultimately, it doesn't matter where one finds oneself along life's ways, whether one's older, whether one's younger. It's not magic. It's not wishful thinking. It's gleaning from our age-old traditions, plural, in a way that can change and improve our personal lives. This morning, I want to focus in on one area. There is a chasm of difference between that which is simple and that which is simplistic. Einstein's great aphorism, the sign of true genius is to make something as simple as possible, but not more so. Not simplistic, simple. One simple area to which I want to focus. It's simply stated, understanding the difference between I have to versus I get to. Think about it. How often do you lament that you have to do something? I have to go to work. I have to go to church. I have to drive my child or children to school. I have to help them with their homework. I have to go to a doctor's appointment, or I have to visit with my accountant or my lawyer. I have to be with my extended family for Thanksgiving or whatever holiday or occasion. What about changing your perspective? What about reframing the narrative? How about this? Not I have to, but I get to go to work. I get to go to church. I get to drive my child or children. I get to help them with their homework. I get to go to my accountant or my doctor. I get to be with family, as imperfect as they are, for the holidays and family get-togethers. I get to make my bed or to buy groceries, to mow the lawn, or to fix the flat tire on my car, or to hire a contractor. The importance of perspective. Seek to gain perspective. It's inseparably tied to seeking wisdom. But this is key. This is the fulcrum issue here. Don't do it at the expense of another person's misery. Don't build yourself up, essentially, at the expense of someone else. Within Judaism, the theological thrust is rabbinic. It's not tantamount to the Bible, but it's very important to the Bible. We all depend on interpretation of the text. And within the broad brushstroke of Jewish theology, there is a seminal collection of works called the Talmud. It's comprised of 63 different folios. It's encyclopedic. It's filled with law and lore. It's filled with wisdom. It's filled with foolishness. It really is a reflection of life, a snapshot in historical time. And there's a section in the Talmud that reads as follows. If you're approaching your neighborhood and you hear crying and turmoil in the vicinity of your home, you should never, underscore, never say, please God, let it not be my house. It's difficult. It's counterintuitive because our immediate reaction, understandably, a very human way, is our own needs and the people around whom we love. But by responding in that way, you're effectively saying it's okay if there's crying and turmoil in your neighbor's home or in a stranger's home. I have to, as opposed to I get to, isn't building yourself up at the expense of others. It isn't I get to go to work, others are unemployed. It isn't I get to raise my children, others don't have children, or their children are deceased, or they're estranged, or they're troubled. It isn't I get to take care of my health because others are struggling with dreaded disease, or I get to go to my accountant because others are struggling financially. Let's be honest, I do it, we all do it. At times we'll compare ourselves to someone less fortunate. Look, it could be worse. Look at him, look at her. What are we doing? Intellectually, emotionally, everyone gets a pass. Intellectually, what are we doing? We're building ourselves up by essentially, if not putting someone down, categorizing others in a manner in which we do elevate ourselves. I have to versus I get to is more deeply understanding your obligations. That's the gift inherent in them. I have to versus I get to is the ability to change one's perspective independent of anyone or anything else. It's internal. It's not dependent on external comparisons. After it's all said and done, it's not. How many of us complain when our flight is late or when the in-flight entertainment isn't working? How many of us complain our homes are in need of repair and bellyache over the cost and the hassle? Really? This is not because there are people who are homeless, but look within. What a gift to have a home, for those of us who do, or an apartment, or wherever we live. Unbelievable. How many of us complain about the food not being hot in, of all places, a restaurant, the privilege of sitting down and being served food, and ideally with friends or community? How many of us complain that our children are less than perfect and giving us aggravation? I constantly joke. Jill, my wife and I, well, that's not three people, Jill is my wife, and I. Next time I address you, I'll have the good fortune of speaking of polygamy, but Jill and I are blessed to have three children, and I very affectionately, and I actually consider our son-in-law our fourth, so I affectionately refer to them as my delinquents, but not my grandson, incidentally. He's perfect. I just want to make that very clear for the record. But we complain about our children, and a lot of that is natural, and there's settings in which to do that, because they are less than perfect, because we're less than perfect. Learning to differentiate between I have versus I get to is not the same thing as settling for mediocrity. It doesn't mean you can't have an opinion or be critical of things or others. It's not a fair expectation to even set out to do that. It doesn't mean you can't compete and strive to win. You ought to. These are healthy things, provided there's a high measure of honesty and integrity. It's a perspective of being more appreciative of the things you do have. The Hebrew word for appreciation, haracha, or ma'arich, has a root, arach, or aruch, depending on the conjugation, which means value. It's the ability to see the inherent value, yes, in inanimate things as well as human interaction. Yes, all of us have many things of which we have to engage. We have to engage in life. I have to go to work if I want to maintain my lifestyle and my family, let alone my personal passions. And there is no shame in that. There's a rabbinic thought within the broad brushstroke and ancient expanse of Jewish history that argues one of the most noble, one of the most holy things a human being can do is to help build infrastructure and provide jobs for others, Jews and non-Jews alike. I have to do these things. We have to do these things. I have to follow certain laws. We have to follow certain conventions. Need I say that's called reality? Need I further say that's facing up to responsibility? But what about applying the same perspective to religious life and practice? I have to, as opposed to I get to. It's not merely that I have to take part in my community, in my church, and I do consider this not in a possessive sense, but as one who belongs. This church is my church, or my synagogue, but I also get to. Wow, the perspective changes. It's not merely that I have to struggle with God. The very notion of the word Israel, Yisrael in Hebrew, it means struggle with God. The hope is it's not just a struggle, it's also an embrace of God. It's not merely I have to struggle with the notion of God, the notion of meaning, fulfillment, purpose. For heaven's sakes, I get to. What a privilege. What a healthy perspective. I get to join a church or a synagogue. I get to pay dues. I get to take upon myself financial responsibilities to support holy places such as this. Never understood that mindset where people would be put upon to ask to support holy causes. Never got it as a child and certainly well into my adult years. Isn't that why we're here in part? Today is your Sabbath. Comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat, which means to cease. It does not mean to rest. The Hebrew Shabbat vayinafash. God ceases, pulls back, and then rests. Aren't we here in part to gain perspective in our pursuit of wisdom and the attainment of wisdom? You can become more positive even in the face of uncertainty and loss by changing your perspective. You can choose to not let a bad day or a stretch of bad days make you feel like you have a bad life. I say this with the height of sensitivity and respect because you know and I know that pain is inevitable, but maybe this is something we don't know. Misery, on the other hand, is a choice. Perspective is key to life. To gain that perspective, may I say in a very forthright manner, you need not look further than our wise and our exceedingly rich Judeo-Christian traditions. It's there. It's always been there. So may I further suggest, keep searching, keep digging, but more than anything, do so, not merely because you have to, but dare I say, you get to. And together can we say, Amen.